Great. Well, thank you, everybody. That was a great panel that we just had, and I hope that we'll do the same here. I want to start with asking everyone to give a little bit of a brief bio on themselves, and I'll include myself in this, in that we were talking about the zig and the zag about careers, and when I first got to Washington to work on the Senate side, there were only 5 Latinos in professional positions in the US Senate. And it was, of course it was like California and Florida and New York and Texas, but it was so unbelievable that everywhere we went, we were always the only Latino in the room. And that has changed so much, and I think that this evolution of representation has really been one that we've been working on for a very long time because we've been marginalized for a very long time. And even though we're making remarkable improvements, we're still behind the curve. So that's very, very, very important to understand that there are really brilliant moments that are of change that is occurring, but it's still leaving us behind the curve. So with that in mind, I'll turn it over to Flavio to give us a brief introduction of himself. And
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Flavio Morales. I'm an independent producer. Started my career when I was 17 in high school with a public access TV show. Most of you guys, it's like YouTube, but for back in the day. And it was me and my brothers and my best friend. Did that for many years. That opened the door to get me into the music industry. I worked as a publicist. I worked as marketing, and everything was, at the time, I was bilingual, I was bicultural, and that was my superpower. So in that time, before I turned 22, I had worked for Levi's, I had worked for Coke, Microsoft, then I got into advertising, and I worked at Wine & Kennedy, which is one of the leading ad agencies in the country, as a Latino liaison, where I got to work with Alfonso Cuarón on his first set of TV commercials at the time, again, English and Spanish. Led me to join Walter Ulloa to do a startup bilingual network called LATV, where I worked there for 6 years. Then I realized I wasn't an owner. I was just an employee. So then I actually went out looking for another job, and I ended up at Telemundo for 10 years, leading up Mundos, which was, again, bilingual, bicultural cable network, introduced bilingual reality with I Love Jenny with Jerry Rivera. Then went independent, because I couldn't get promoted at NBC because I was from Telemundo. And I was told that I couldn't jump to NBC because I had to wipe off the Spanish language off me. True story. Went independent, but then I got to work with Eva Longoria on the Alma Awards, Robert Rodriguez for El Rey Network, which then got me the attention at Endemol Shine with Chris Abrego, where together we launched offices in Mexico. We started scripted production with Netflix on a show called El Vato, and then Nicky Jam, and had an incredible run, and I'm very fortunate. And today at 12 o'clock, it'll be announced that I'm a producer on Like Water for Chocolate, which started production this week for HBO Max in Mexico City, which we're very proud of. And just to give you an idea how slow this works, it took me 8 years to get the show from getting the book to actually cameras rolling in Mexico yesterday. So that in a nutshell is who I am.
thank you.
Wow, how do I follow that illustrious career? It's always so fun for me to be in DC because I thought I was going to pursue a career in policy. I was very passionate about policy. I grew up in Southeast LA, Alejandra, HP. Super proud of where I am from. I just always knew I wanted to make a difference, make an impact. As I went through college, I started leaning more towards the research side and the data side, and I started becoming passionate about measuring what matters and making sure that we were represented in data and technology, because that's how decisions are largely made. So I started working at the Gina Davis Institute doing media research. That's where I started kind of noticing and shifting away from policy into media, because I started recognizing that there's a lot of power in media. Policy I started seeing is sometimes frustratingly slow, very reactive, and is like fixing a lot of past issues in a way that media is proactive, and there's a very a proactive way of changing the way that people are thinking and feeling about how we see ourselves, how we see other people. So I started pursuing a career in media, and I landed at Nielsen. I knew I wanted to work at Nielsen because I felt like it was blending all of the worlds that I wanted: media, data, and it wasn't policy, but it was an institutional company. Today, I get to work on a very special product at Nielsen called Inclusion Analytics, and we measure representation within content. Again, getting back to measuring what matters and getting this important data in the hands of our clients and decision makers who are making decisions around which content they invest in. So that's what I get to do today.
Hello, everybody. I'm Joaquin Castro. I'm Congressman representing my hometown of San Antonio, Texas. And I am in my 21st year of public service. I spent 10 years in the state legislature in the deep minority party in Texas. And now I'm in my 11th year here. And as you can imagine, over the course of 21 years, I've had a chance to work on a full range of different policy issues: immigration, healthcare, education, economic development, and so forth. But several years ago now, I guess about 4 years ago, after the shooting in El Paso, where you had this madman that drove 10 hours and killed 23 Latinos because he considered them, quote unquote, Hispanic invaders to Texas, I really put my foot on the gas on the Latino cultural space in the United States. Because if you think about it, the Latino narrative has largely been left out of the larger American story or narrative. If you think about how many Latinos or Latinas you read about growing up in schools in the United States. And so really started to work on representation from hard news to Hollywood. So as chair of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus at the time, we met with studios, with talent, with book publishers, newspapers, and so forth, to start to try to, obviously not single-handedly, but be part of an ensemble effort with Felix, with so many others, with people inside the industries, to try to fill in that cultural black hole for the Latino community. Because I believe in my work that it's not just a matter of cultural inconvenience, of being left out. It's a very dangerous position for a community to be in. And that's what I think was how you partly explain El Paso, is that our community has been defined by a lot of stereotypes, negative stereotypes, and at the same time, our contributions as a community have not been acknowledged or celebrated. And so it creates a complete misunderstanding and negative picture of who we are as a community. So I'll get into it a little bit later, but a lot of my work has been, I think, remedial in some ways, but also very proactive and collateral in others. So great to be with you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Buenos dias. My name is Carla, and I just want to say that you've given me a lot to think about, all three of you. What an honor to share this moment. Speaking of cultural inconvenience, I know for me, as the firstborn American in my family, I felt I grew up in a state of cultural confusion. My mother's Mexican, and I hold both citizenships, but my father's Bulgarian. And I always felt like the other. I always didn't know which box really to check, but Spanish was my first language. And it wasn't until I got much older that I realized there are many others like me. And I will say that as a practicing opera singer, which has been my first profession, I sort of gravitated into music because it was a realm where language and culture and passports and nationality didn't seem to matter as much. Music for me has always been not just a universal language, but it's the tie to the emotional realm of the human condition. And that is a space I love to explore. But I want to give a special thanks to someone here, Alejandra Ceja, who really changed my life about 10 years ago. Having performed professionally for a while, she very kindly invited me to come to California and speak with some young students. And I will say that it was at that moment that I saw so many faces that reminded me of myself. And we sang together, we sang De Colores and all kinds of songs. And when I looked at those faces and I said, I expect you to do great things, I could tell that they were immediately transformed by that idea that I was there on behalf of the White House. I was there to tell them the president expects great things of you. And all of a sudden, those kids said, well, the president knows who I am, and he expects great things. And it was under the Obama administration. And I saw the change that took place with those youngsters, primarily Latino. And that really drove me into where I am today as the first, in my position, senior advisor and envoy for cultural exchange at the National Endowment for the Arts. It's been a wonderful journey getting here, sort of tangentially also spending some time at Harvard, where I continue to teach cultural diplomacy and cultural exchange. So I look forward to talking more about that, but thank you so much for having me today.
Thank you. Veronica, I was hoping that you might help us set the table about where the numbers are in representation and where are the success points, where are the drag points in those numbers?
Yeah, thank you. So Latino representation, as we hear it year after year when the reports come out, we're lagging, right? What we're putting forward with Nielsen is a data set that allows us to check this data on a regular basis, tie it to performance data so that we can find those stories of successful Latino content and break it down further, right? So if we look at overall Latino representation, it's about 13%, but when we remove Spanish language networks, that falls all the way down to 6% representation. I was looking at which genres pop up for Latino representation, and when we remove English language, there's only 2-3 genres that pop up that have parity representation, so over 19% representation, and it's comedy drama, and surprisingly thriller. I was like, where is this coming from? Because it was surprising. I couldn't immediately think of a title, so I double-clicked on it, and I saw, oh, a lot of the content is Spanish language content on Netflix. I was like, okay, so that's why when so many of us feel underrepresented is because we are. There isn't enough content being produced that represents our stories. Again, at 6%, we're one of the most diverse communities. There's just no way. So yeah, with the data set that we have, we're seeing that Latino content actually draws new audiences onto platforms, so I'll get a little bit into that later.
Flavio, you gave us an outline of what it takes to produce content and how difficult it is, how frustrating it is, how most people who started don't finish it. How were you able to be so successful? What do you think are the key elements, the secret sauce in what you've been able to do?
Well, part of it is dumb luck, but the other part, and I always say this to people, it doesn't take a lot to get into the industry. It's not for brilliance, and that's the reality. It's thousands of hours of content that need to get produced, and some people just have to just get lucky and they're somebody's nephew or cousin or something, and that's how it really works. I was very fortunate, and I didn't think I was, that I was bilingual and that I was doing this content that at times I felt like I was the only one doing it. And then all of a sudden it rolled around. So at one point there was Mundos, there was MTV3, there was Fusion. There was a group of companies that were beginning to believe in this. And then what happens is, bigger companies start cutting down and saying, if you put it in Spanish, they'll watch it as well. And the audience, the reality is that the Latino audience is probably one of the most open audiences to good content, regardless of language. They just like good stories. And so they'll, when you go, for example, if you go to Netflix and you want to pitch a Latino story, usually the first thing will be, have you pitched it to our office in Latin America? They have the budget, right? And I don't know if you guys saw, but they did the Selena series. that even though it was in English, it was done through Mexico, it was done with pesos, not dollars. And I mean, that's the challenge that you have in an industry that sees us, in a black and white. And so for myself, it was always sort of like pushing it. And one of the earliest things that I was taught while I was at Telemundo is that I couldn't produce it unless I had advertiser support. And we sold stuff before it got aired, which is what's interesting right now, the current trends with fast channels, which are OTT, which means when you're watching Freebie, there's a commercial break. Or when you watch Peacock, and if you don't pay for the big service, you get commercials. That's old school TV, that's now with the new technology. And so one of the reasons I came to DC is I feel like instead of us pushing necessarily the studios, is we need to go to the advertiser. We need to go to the advertiser and say, look at the audience, and they deserve this kind of content, and then pushing the studios. But entertainment is not a fair business. It is the most corrupt industry you will ever get in, and that's why my son's studying that in college, because Dad's going to get him in. But it has no rules, and so you got to learn that there are no rules and how to apply them to get your stories out there.
Carla, as someone who represents what we would think of as the high art of opera, what is the approach to getting young Latinos into the opera world, and what have been some of the obstacles that you faced being in that opera world, being a non-traditionalist in the opera world?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question, because I actually feel a huge sense of pride as a Latina and as a Mexicana, because Mexico has so many wonderful opera singers, and now we're seeing so many Mexican American and Latinx opera singers really kind of taking over the world of opera. And of course, there's a beautiful tradition of singing. So it's interesting for those who follow it closely that I think there is actually a very strong tie. I had a friend in the Mexican government once tell me our #1 export is opera singers from Mexico. And I think now we're seeing a lot of sort of first generation Mexican Americans follow that path here. I will say though that I think that my experience has always been having to break the barriers in a very personal way, and as such, I felt very siloed from the time I was very young. And so maybe if you'll indulge me in a story, which I haven't shared publicly much, but I really want to encourage those of us who have felt this to start talking about it. I grew up in Michigan in what would be called an underserved community, and was the only Latino in my school. And I grew up with a nickname that still pains me to say. I was called the Mexican burrito thief. This is what all of the kids at school called me, elementary school through middle school. And you might say, well, why? Well, I was seen as Mexican. The only Mexican or Spanish word they knew was burrito. And thief, because they thought automatically that my being here meant that my parents were stealing a job from their parents. And I think, probably many of us in this room have experienced something like that at some point. The way that I have tried to deal with this, whether it was in my professional opera career or in every day, is really trying to combat those stigmas and any kind of negative stereotype, which I know you mentioned, in a way that kind of follows Michelle Obama's "when they go low, we go higher." But it is very, very hard. And just to sort of conclude with your question, I think I went into opera singing because it was a way to make my screams as a child beautiful. It was a way that I could sort of scream out the anger and the frustration that I felt for all of that bullying and camouflage it as something, acceptable and passable and maybe even beautiful. So it's deeply personal to me.
Thank you. Congressman, we're in the middle of a writer and actor strike. How is that helping or hurting the gains that we've made in terms of representation? And are the unions addressing the need to create a pipeline for minorities into those unions without having all the financial burden put on them at the beginning of their entry into the unions, like dues and initiation fees?
Yeah, I guess a few things. First, this fight over artificial intelligence will be for some talent an existential one if the guilds, the unions lose that fight with the studios, I think. And it will also be a bellwether about how artificial intelligence will affect other industries. Because if you think about it, the entertainment industry and the media industry in the United States is one of the most unionized industries in the country. So if you can't hold the line through the union in an industry that's very unionized, then I don't think you're going to do, my prediction is you don't do as well in other industries where they don't have to negotiate with anybody, they just make a decision and move on. So that's a big deal for everybody, including Latinos at a time where, as human beings, right, you have more Latino talent and executives, producers, et cetera, that are trying to get into the industry. Well, if more people are being replaced by AI, that makes it tougher for our community disproportionately. But in terms of just the existing system now, both the corporate side and the union side are lacking. And let me set this up for a second. The numbers, and it was mentioned, the numbers are low on what I would consider the corporate side decisions, on who's in front of the screen, for example, the actors, who you engage as producers, the directors, the executives, et cetera. To the tune of Latinos in a city of Los Angeles that's 47% Latino, we make up somewhere between 6 and 8% of the industry. So just a complete imbalance there in a city that's extremely Latino. And so on the corporate side, you're lacking, but then on the union side, you're lacking also because, well, I'll give you an example. When we went to meet with the Screen Actors Guild in 2019 and asked them, well, like, what are your demographics of your membership? They didn't keep track of the demographics of their membership. They still don't keep track, SAG. And again, I have publicly supported the unions in their position in this negotiation, but the truth is the truth. Some of the unions are not, as far as I can tell, making the effort they should to help make sure that their own guilds, that their own membership is also reflective of American society. And I'm not talking necessarily about quotas or so I got to exactly hit a certain number, but just making an effort. Because to me, if the first part of accountability and improvement is transparency and understanding where you are, taking a snapshot of where you are. If an institution, in whatever field it's in, is unwilling to do that, then to me it means that they're not really going to make much an effort on the second part. And the reason, Felix, that this is so tough for our community is because particularly like in my parents' generation, my dad is 83, my mom is 76, and even after that, and certainly before that, a lot of our folks were told to go work with their hands, to go into vocations. You've probably heard some of you that are my age or younger, your parents or grandparents say that. They were directed out of academic tracks and into vocational tracks. So a big part of our workforce is concentrated in vocations. And yet, the numbers that I had heard from one of the biggest unions in LA was that their union, even though the city is 47% Latino, that their union was about 16% Latino. Certainly better than the corporate side, right, generally, but not nearly where it should be for the city. And then, so you're locked out of both the corporate side, and then you've got a lot of people working with their hands, carpenters, et cetera, and you're locked out of that working labor side as well. Yeah, so it is a challenge on both of those ends.
Yeah. Flavio, keeping with that theme of what is happening with the strikes, how do we get pushed out of the SAG and after contracts and are required to do programming or content that does not come under those contracts? I mean, some of the work that you've done would not come under SAG-AFTRA.
Yeah, I mean, you can do anything international. So like Water for Chocolate, it's in Spanish language for Max Latin America. It'll air in the US, but it's being produced in Mexico in Spanish. So, and we couldn't hire any writers that were from the Writers Guild. Even though it was in Spanish, they wouldn't do it. So that was a challenge because we lost a lot of people. It really is a really difficult time, and as the congressman was stating, to get into the industry, you have a college degree, you want to get in, and you want to get in through William Morris or CAA in an agency. Well, the only way to go in is to go in through the mailroom. And the mailroom pays, I think, $34,000 a year. So if you're a college graduate with debt and you're going to go live in Los Angeles and you're expected to wear a suit every day and not the same suit every day, and lunch on the west side is not cheap, and rent is not cheap, how many Latinos are really going to get an opportunity to get into the traditional Hollywood way of getting into the industry? It's really difficult. Internships have to be paid internships. I came from a generation where the internship was free. I had interns. When I was at Telemundo, I had constantly 20 interns. And then when we realized we had to pay them, we went down to 6. And you can go back and forth about that, but it gave you an access into the industry. And it's, again, it's very difficult. And I think right now, the one thing that the strike is showing us is already these writers, regardless of color, we're living paycheck to paycheck. It breaks my heart to go into LinkedIn and just start looking people that are looking to be copywriters, that are looking for any kind of freelance gig because the rent is due. This is going to be like a big change. We were talking about it 2 years ago, there were 400 scripted shows produced a year. 400. That is no longer going to happen. It's going to go half or less than that. So writers that were working on their first show, that were already getting screwed out of getting a decent paycheck, may not be able to get back in the industry. And the one thing that I'm also like really big on is like, what's the media landscape globally? We're very focused, and I'm guilty of it. Like, we all want the Oscar, we all want the Golden Globe, we all want to be on broadcast. All those things are really dead. You know, The Last of Us is based on a video game. You know, and when you look at gaming, when you look at our demographics, that's where the audience is. That's where the potential is globally. You know, in Brazil, everyone watches their content on their phone. They don't watch it in a living room. You know, and so we also need to start really looking at it from a media landscape of like, where's the future, and prepare ourselves to what that next is. And I think that a lot of times we're kind of put out there and it's like, well, we want a TV show on NBC. That really doesn't matter anymore. And so we got to start looking at what that next thing is going to be.
Veronica, tell us about the difference between what's happening with the streaming world and the cable world, and whose ratings are going up and whose ratings are going down.
Yeah, I mean, everyone here probably personally like is watching most of their content on streaming, and we're seeing that reflected in the numbers. Spanish-dominant Latinos are still tuning into broadcast, but Latinos, we just released our latest Latino Diverse Intelligence series, and we see that Latinos are the only identity group that has broken over 50% of their total TV viewing time is in streaming. So that's pretty incredible, where we've always been mobile first, digital first, and like quick adopters. So we're going to streaming. I wanted also just call to a point that Flavio brought up earlier with distribution channels changing. So like the streaming landscape is also changing. It's not just subscription services. We're seeing more and more ad-supported services. And I think that that is a real opportunity for content to thrive, right? Because like Flavio mentioned, I also really believe that advertisers are the way to get more investment for content, because they're the ones trying to engage an audience. So sometimes it's broad reach, but other times is high resonance. Like if I see my advertisement alongside this program that I love, my purchase intent goes up. So what's really cool about what the stats that we're trying to put out is those success stories. And we have done studies looking at the impact of inclusive versus non-inclusive content, and we see higher KPIs amongst the inclusive content. And if we get advertisers, when we have, so with my product, yes, networks buy into it, but it's a lot of the ad sales teams, because they're trying to position their content to advertisers, because advertisers are looking for that multicultural content. So it's like funky navigating that, but it's good that we know brands really care about it. So it's important for the networks to put it forward.
Carla, tell us a little bit about what the challenges are to being an opera singer today for a young person? And are the songs and the narratives that are the storylines, is there any way to make them more modern and more accessible to young people?
Well, that's a big question. I will say a couple of things. First of all, this year we have something very special in the opera world. Florencia en las Amazonias by Daniel Catan is having its debut at the Metropolitan Opera. And that is, I believe, the first time that a work by a fairly contemporary Mexican composer is being shown. Unfortunately, he passed away a few years ago, but it's a real first in my world, so I'm really looking forward to that. I will just speak from my experience. My career as an opera singer was primarily based on performing the title role of Carmen. And it probably was stereotypical casting. I didn't really mind it. As a kid, I gladly, grew up listening to that opera and dressing my brothers up as a bull and a bullfighter. And, it was certainly a dream come true. But there's no question that stereotypes in casting exist very, very much in the field. And I know it's also an issue that many of my Asian American singer friends are facing on that side. I will also maybe, if I may, invite you to think about 4 ways that I think that opera and the arts can be thought of at this moment of sort of thinking about how do we integrate cultural exchange and sharing of ideas. And one is the traditional governmental path of cultural diplomacy, which has a very specific goal of fostering mutual understanding, but to promote foreign policy objectives. So like my colleagues at the State Department, and that's a lot of the work I've done as an arts envoy, would be to go to different places and think about how to do that work. Now, cultural exchange, which ties to my title at the National Endowment for the Arts, has that end goal of fostering mutual understanding, but without necessarily the foreign policy objectives. And so I really invite you to think about that, because I think cultural exchange, or the exchange of ideas in music and art and education, happens every day. And we can all play a role as Latinos, as women, as men, in fostering those conversations and developing that trust. There are 2 other areas that I'm seeing a lot of possibility for in the arts. One is the awareness months. I'm delighted that we're in Hispanic Heritage Month now. What does that mean? And I see that as more of a one-way street, whereas the exchanges are about listening and exchanging. Awareness months are really about fostering knowledge, sharing knowledge, and celebrating, right? So this is a great time for more storytelling, for more engagement. And the last category I think of is one that's really an inward journey about identity. So for me, that's a complex question. My father being European, my mother being Mexican, and I was born here. And it's also an area where we're looking at the complexities, the nuances of not just cultural heritage, but pronouns and what we're now starting to think about in terms of gender and how we identify in that way. It could also be how we identify in the professional workplace. But I do think that the arts, and maybe opera, but all kinds of artistic avenues, can play a strong role in those sort of 4 buckets of possibility for us to exchange ideas and learn more about culture.